and you are welcome to Africa Link, the podcast connecting you to the stories that matter.
Africa Link, every weekday here on DW.
Russia's relationship with Africa has been evolving significantly in recent years. From security cooperation to economic interests and diplomatic engagement, Russia has been navigating the complexities of international politics and regional dynamics. Let's dig into this with Bram Posthumus, DW's West Africa correspondent. Also with me is Privilege Musvanhiri, DW correspondent in Harare, Zimbabwe. Welcome to the program, gentlemen. Festive greetings or season's greetings to you all. It's the 26th of December, 2024. So I can imagine what all of you are up to. But let me dig straight into action, Bram. We always talk about Russia's relationship with Africa. Let's take us back down memory lane. Where does Russia's relationship with Africa begin?
It begins at independence from the former colonial powers. Guinea, for instance, often forgotten, but a key ally of the then Soviet Union. Obviously, the Russian Federation didn't exist at the time. And it was both in terms of military cooperation, also business. Guinea delivers bauxite to the world, and Russia is a great producer of aluminium, still is. So that was one. You should think about the former Portuguese colonies. All of them were helped by the Soviet Union in the struggle against colonial rule. Mind you, if you look at the flag of Mozambique, it's got an AK-47 in it, which is a Russian arm, an iconic one. And then, Algeria, Egypt, and various other countries, Mali, for instance, as well, have intermittently, from independence onwards, been major clients of Russian arms, then obviously manufactured in the Soviet Union. So this relation goes way, way back.
Right. It goes way, way back. So how different was the relationship back then compared to now?
Well, I think in many ways there are similarities. First of all, the essential part of the cooperation then as now is military. It's arms delivery, military advisors. In the case of Russia, there were defense pacts, collaborative efforts. And so the military has always played a key role in all these relationships. The difference being perhaps with the Russian Federation today is that it has become more privatized, with mercenary outfits playing a key role rather than the Ministry of Defense, as always was the case when the Soviet Union still existed. So there are parallels, there are similarities.
And is there any sense that the relationship is getting stronger, just about the same? Is there even any key thing to sort of get out of this relationship?
That has become much harder to predict since earlier this month, Russia lost a key asset in the Middle East, Syria, which was part of the global imperialist building that was going on. And Syria was an absolute linchpin in all that, in that there were two bases that were used to supply the Sahel countries, for instance, about which we are going to talk later, with military kits and with mercenaries. So it's difficult to predict how this is going to go and play itself out, also because the Ukraine war that Russia started in 2012 and then full scale in 2022 has been a drain on its resources. So it's hard to predict how this is going to go even in the next year.
But still, I really want to get out, is Russia's relationship with Africa, or the different African countries that it's in business with, is it stronger as things stand now compared to before?
Well, it is in the sense that if you cast your mind back to the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, the country absented itself from the African continent almost entirely. Just a simple token of that, Aeroflot, the national airline, stopped serving almost all capitals except for Cairo. And so there was an almost complete absence. It's been coming back in the mid-2010s, when there was, a standoff with the West developing to begin with, and secondly, the competition over geopolitical turf got into second, third, and fourth gear, and this is where Africa comes in as absolute key to, holding influence and having a footprint around the globe, and so that's where the importance of Africa began to assert itself. For instance, you remember that in Sochi in 2018, the seaside resort, the Russian seaside resort of Sochi, the first Russia-African summit was held with 43 heads of state attending. That was a big event, and it was correctly so seen as a success for Russian diplomacy. We're 6 years down the line now, things have changed, but I think if you want to position the importance of Africa, the re-emergence of Africa as a key to constructing a global empire from the Russian perspective, you should go to the mid-2010s.
Right. So in a nutshell, you'd say Russia is intensifying its relations with African countries. In a nutshell, this is where we are now.
In various areas, not across the board. It's obviously there are a number of key countries that we'll have to talk about later on. It's been concentrating its efforts on the likes of the Central African Republic, the Sahel countries, Sudan, Libya, where it has an opportunity to do so because there was either a vacuum or public discontent with previous important players, but you cannot really say that there is an increase across the board. There are areas where it's working for Russia and there are areas where it isn't working.
Right. We will definitely dig deeper into that. But hey, Privilege, let me come to you because Southern Africa historically has had some sort of relationship with Russia. Can you elaborate a bit on that? Russia's historical ties with Southern Africa, including your own country, Zimbabwe.
Thank you, Eddy. Like Bram said, if you look at Southern Africa, there is that military cooperation that dates back to the days when most of the countries in Southern Africa, especially the liberation movements, were fighting against colonialism. This starts from your 70s way into the 90s, your countries like, if you mention in Southern Africa, your liberation movements like in Zimbabwe, the ZANU-PF, SWAPO, your FRELIMO in Mozambique, all of these, they received military assistance from Russia to fight colonialism. I will mention particularly Zimbabwe. Most of the nationalists and liberation leaders were leading the liberation movements, received military training in Russia. And Bram mentioned something of very interest, the AK-47. Our army in Zimbabwe, since fighting against colonialism, the AK-47 sticks out, and up to today, it is still the leading weapon that is used by our army. And in fact, in Zimbabwe, our defense industries, they are now manufacturing the AK-47. So you see, that's how strong it is in terms of military cooperation. Then when you come to your things like investments and everything, I think Russia has not been that strong on that end. And you notice they are not as visible as what you can see with the Chinese in terms of the development or even the investments that they are making in this region.
Right. So thanks for giving that sort of historical context. What about now? How is Russia perceived in Zimbabwe and Southern Africa as a whole?
I would say that it is viewed in two ways. One, as a benefactor. Two, as a symbol of fighting against Western hegemony. In a country like Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe has found Russia like a close partner in terms of fighting against Western sanctions. You recall that Zimbabwe received sanctions from early 2000 when the country embarked on the land reform programs and the chaotic program that followed. So it has leaned towards Russia in terms of getting that support, maybe at the UN level, when they are also trying to speak against sanctions. So it sees itself as Russia is a highly sanctioned country, and Zimbabwe then wants to align itself to say, look, we are both in the same situation. Therefore, we can fight in the same corner. In terms of being a benefactor, we have seen Russia donating different things. You talk of grain, you talk of fertilizer. In terms of Zimbabwe, they recently donated air ambulances. We have helicopters that are being used in Zimbabwe right now as air ambulances that were donated by the Russians. So it's in that sense where they are looking at Russia as a benefactor that gifts them these things like your fertilizers and like. And on the other hand, it's a symbol and an ally of fighting against Western hegemony.
Right. Let me come to you, Bram, because clearly what we've established here is, in one way or the other, Russia is to some extent a key ally to some African countries. But let's try to create some sort of mapping here, right? We're talking about a continent of about 54 different countries, and we talk about Russia's relationship with this continent of Africa. Which countries exactly are we talking about, and which countries are the closest in terms of relationship or allyship to Russia?
At this point in time, probably and arguably, it's the Central African Republic, which is the closest. You can even argue that the Central African Republic is run by either Wagner or the Africa Corps, whichever way you want to call the mercenary outfit.
Well, that's a very bold statement to say that a whole country, the Central African Republic, is being run by Russia. Why?
Well, first of all, the main military advisors to President Touadera of the Central African Republic are employed by Wagner or the Africa Corps. So that's the first thing, the strategic outset of whatever the government there needs to do to fight off militias and rebels elsewhere in the country. They are all coming from the ranks of the private military corporations.
Okay.
The relationship between Russia and the private military outfits that come from there, first Wagner, then the Africa Corps, date back to 2018. That was when there was a first contact. And the reason was very simple. The government of the Central African Republic had a serious problem with rebel forces who were a threat to the capital, Bangui. And in fact, if you cast your mind back to January 2021, Wagner managed to fight off a rebel force that was threatening to take the capital. So that was something that established their reputation in the country. Since then, they have been absolute key to government military strategies against the rebels. All the key advisors to President Touadera of the Central African Republic are Russian. And of course, in compensation for that, Wagner or the Africa Corps, whichever name they choose for themselves, can help themselves to the resources. They run gold mines, timber operations, and so they can be said to be, if anything, the prime military strategic mover in the country, and quite possibly also one of the major economic powerhouses that is driving the Central African economy.
Right. So just to be clear, what you're saying is the Central African Republic obviously had an issue with rebel groups and all, and they clearly were not satisfied with how Western forces helped deal with the rebel situation, and you can correct me anytime if I'm wrong. And so they introduce Russia into the mix, and the Russian forces seemed to be getting the results, at least in the beginning. What they needed was being done. And so that is exactly why, again, correct me whenever I'm wrong, that is why it seems that they have included them in security-wise, strategically, into the arms of government. That is understandable on that front, but it can't be said that they are literally controlling the country, just so we're clear.
Well, they have a major influence in the government of the country. And mind you, if you go to the Central African Republic, you will find that it consists of the capital, Bangui, which is a reasonably functional place, and the rest of the country where the government has been largely absent for a very long time. And quite clearly, the government that controls Bangui was dissatisfied with whatever intervention there had been previously, be it French, be it the United Nations, all of them failed. And incidentally, the Russian one is failing as well because the country is profoundly unsafe and unstable. But the real issue here is whoever has an influence on the government in Bangui has an influence in the Central African Republic, and Wagner is absolute key to the survival of the government of President Touadéra.
Right. So, Privilege, from what we have heard from Bram, he's sort of zoomed the focus on especially the security situation in the CAR, for example. What are the specific sectors in Southern Africa that you would say Russia is heavily involved in?
Just a helicopter view of the Russia's interest in Southern Africa. Most of them are economic and especially mining. In terms of military, it is a different case altogether. They have less influence than what it is obtaining in West Africa. In Southern Africa, of course, yes, Russia doesn't question the governance of their allies. They do not, question whether if it is disputed elections and like, they don't delve into that. They would rather even prop up whatever regime that is close to them in this region. But in terms of the cooperation, we have seen that Russia is heavily involved, especially now is trying to pull African countries. You have South Africa just next door, which is a member of BRICS. So looking at a country like Zimbabwe, in Zimbabwe, Russian investments, they have not had a big or what we could call a roaring success so far. Why? Soon after Russia invaded Ukraine, the Western sanctions have hamstrung Russian investments, and it has caused Russia to abandon what could have been one of Zimbabwe's biggest platinum mines. It is said that Russia's VI Holdings had planned to build Zimbabwe's biggest platinum mine under what they call the Great Dyke Investments. This mining venture was going to hold up to about an estimated 182 million tons of ore in terms of platinum to be mined over 20 years. But because of its involvement now in Ukraine, it is now hamstrung because all the investments that they've done, they cannot now fundraise in order for them to make the investments. For those that have been analyzing, they say that because of Russia's involvement in Ukraine, Russian companies can no longer be able to raise capital in London or New York. So that has made Russian investments very difficult in this region. But its influence in terms of investments, in terms of maybe the economic cooperation, we can talk of South Africa next door, which is in BRICS. So because South Africa is in BRICS, most African countries, like in Southern Africa, are now being motivated to want to join BRICS, because they say maybe in BRICS they can be able to get concessionary lines of credit, as opposed to the Bretton Woods institutions. If you talk of your IMF and World Bank, I think recently we have seen that report, which is saying that a lot of South African countries are saddled with huge debts that are coming from these Bretton Woods institutions. So they are now seeing probably BRICS as an alternative in terms of getting concessionary lines of credit. So that's where Russia could be coming in.
Bram, so we cannot talk about Russia's influence on the continent without focusing also on the Sahel region. Tell us about how Russia is connected to the Sahel and the key countries that it's doing business with, and broaden it up a bit for us in terms of exactly that sort of relationship and the cooperation. It's like, are we talking military? Are we talking influencing with business, influencing from the cultural side of things? What exactly is Russia's relationship with the Sahel?
Right. Russia's relationship with the Sahel very much came out of profound dissatisfaction with the performance of particularly France in the region in fighting, to all intents and purposes, jihadist terrorism. It was making very, very little progress. In fact, the contrary happened. If you cast your minds back to 2012, when the problem began in Mali specifically, the promise was that it was going to be stopped. And in fact, it hasn't. It started spreading, first from the north to central Mali, then into the neighboring countries, and now it is even threatening the coastal countries of Ivory Coast, where I am, Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, Benin, Togo. They've all had attacks from jihadist outfits. So the question came up, and that was even before the coups happened.
So what impact has Russia's involvement had on the geopolitical dynamics of the Sahel, particularly, when you talk about terrorism and political stability?
I'm afraid I have to say entirely negative. If you look at the group that is, tracing conflicts, it's called the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data, ACLED. You will see that the trajectory of the violence in all three countries, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, after the coups, has been a sharp uptick in violence. And 2024 is on course to become the worst year since this all began, and 2025 will be no different if the situation remains in place.
On that strong note, we will end it here, because I 100% agree with what you've just said, Bram, and all that Privilege has also said. At the end of the day, countries should decide for themselves what works for them, what kind of relationship works for them, not for it to benefit, Western powers or Russia or China or whoever. So we will end that there. Many thanks, DW's West Africa correspondent Bram Posthumus, also Privilege Musvanhiri, DW correspondent in Harare, Zimbabwe. Thank you guys for your time.
Get the stories that are shaping the continent here on Africa Link.
Russia's charm offensive has significantly extended Moscow's influence in several African nations. But whether it's a relationship with Russia, China, or the US, the continent must pursue partnerships grounded in mutual respect and shared growth. The future of the continent isn't about choosing sides. It's about forging strategic alliances that empower Africa to thrive on its own terms, ensuring sustainable development and self-reliance. That's how we end this edition of Africa Link. Join the conversation on our Facebook page, DW Africa. Listen to us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from. Click follow so you don't miss an episode. This show was co-produced and edited by Isaac Mugabe. I am Eddy Micah Jr. Thanks for listening, and season's greetings to you all.
DW News
with George Okachi.